I probably don't need to tell you what this is. Half of the people on this planet eat at least a bowl of it every single day. Rice is the staple for civilizations from Southeast Asia to the Caribbean, China to West Africa. And wherever it's grown, it doesn't just provide nutrition, it forms the backbone of entire culinary cultures. This simple grain has built empires, led to the establishment of cities, and been the cause of everything from diplomatic feuds to full-on wars. Its cultivation was the single most important moment in the history of agriculture, and yet somehow, it manages to be everywhere and still overlooked, taken for granted, never given the credit it's actually due. So today on OTR, we're out to change that, to trace its incredible path and wade into its long and often controversial history, and of course, to try some of the best versions of the world's most ancient and enduring rice dishes. This is the story of rice. There's a legend told in the villages of Vietnam that a very long time ago, there were no such things as grains of rice. Instead, every night, rice would grow to the size of basketballs, and each morning, piles of them would proudly roll themselves towards every house and wait outside the front door for the family to wake up, ready to eat. Humans, thanks to rice, had everything they needed, and all rice asked in exchange was a little bit of gratitude, a simple thank you in the form of some decorations left outside to show appreciation. So the people would decorate their houses with tributes to the friendly rice, but one night, a farmer ate too much and fell asleep, forgetting to display his sacred shrine. To the rice gods, this was a sign that humans had begun to take their bounty for granted, so in anger, they shrunk down to a tiny size and decided to stay put out in the fields. From then on, wherever rice would grow, it would be up to the farmers to do the work themselves, or go hungry. This is just one of the countless origin stories and legends about the creation of rice, found in the oral histories of cultures from one side of the planet to the other, because for so much of the world, wherever you find life, well, if you go back far enough, you find rice. Since the beginning of time in this part of the world, rice has been everything. The very foundation of society and the staple crop that allowed cities to form and caused empires to rise and fall. Today across the planet, 14% of every crop pulled from the ground is a rice stalk. And if you put all the rice fields together, it would make the 13th largest country on Earth. 1 billion people on this planet make a living from planting, harvesting, packing, shipping, or selling rice, from Asia to the Americas and almost everywhere in between, with the plant itself cultivated from the lowest points below sea level to the mountains of the Himalayas. It can be grown on water, in the fields, or even high up in the mountains. Where there is rice, there are people. Throughout history, the rice plant has been used to make clothes and insulation, paper, and even particle board. In ancient Korea, it was used as currency for paying taxes, and today it might even rescue your cell phone. Rice is used for preservation, for adding strength to concrete, and for fermenting into alcohol. But of course, most of all, it's used as food, with as much as half of the world's population consuming at least a bowl of rice every single day. Now, alright, this is a story about history, and as hard as it might be to fathom, there is always a first. In this case, someone, somewhere, who became the first person to ever plant and cook some rice, the tiny act that would change everything. And that's usually how these videos begin, but let me issue a caveat. Finding origins is always going to be complicated, not necessarily because the evidence is hard to follow. If you cut through the nonsense, there's usually a decent trail you can follow that leads somewhere before anywhere else. But the problem when it comes to rice is how much nonsense there actually is, mainly because this has become an existential battle for national pride. I mean, the concept of food wars isn't new, like there's stuff like French fries, kimchi, and hummus where multiple countries make a claim. But this is rice. It's different. So with that said, before we get to our first meal, let's start by going back to the very beginning and wading into a fight that's divided the world. Alright, before we get into speculation, let's start with facts. First, the consumption of rice is very, very old, and second, rice is a grass, and before it was first domesticated, variations of wild rice grew across much of the world. But with that said, let's begin with the generally accepted point of origin for the use of rice as a food source, which is China's Yangtze River Valley, specifically here, in the area between today's Ningbo and Hangzhou, at dig sites dating to as far back as 12,000 BC, or 8,000 years before the invention of the wheel, and 2,000 years prior to the fictional lives of the Flintstones. Anyway, this evidence is generally based on rice having famously been found in storage basins. However, what's not as widely known is that rice was just a small component of giant pots filled mostly with nuts and acorns, which probably, not definitely, but most likely, means that rice wasn't actually that widely accessible. Or in other words, it wasn't being farmed yet, just foraged. Let me digress for a second to explain something about how rice works. Basically, the rice we eat is the seed of the plant, and grasses have this thing they do in nature called shattering. What it means is that when the seed becomes ripe, it falls off. That's how the species survives. But when something that's just ripened falls off, it kind of ruins the idea of farming. So at some point, thousands and thousands of years after people filled those basins in China, we see a genetic shift. All of a sudden, the fossilized samples archaeologists found starting around 5000 BC had a mutated gene, one that would stop the plant from shattering and therefore allow farming. This would have been incredibly difficult. It took as long as 8,000 years to be achieved. It would be perhaps the most significant breakthrough in global farming history, and that's not an exaggeration. But as for where it happened, well, that's when we start getting into the controversy. The oldest fossilized remains of non-shattering rice were actually not found in China, but in India, where rice consumption also dates back to the beginning of the written record. Now, Indian legends claim that rice has been consumed in the country since at least 13,000 BC, although with no evidence to support it, it feels like that number might have been chosen only because it's older than what they found in China. But it is without question that rice also has an ancient history in India. It's closely linked to many of the country's great religions, and those claims are also backed up by archaeology. The Indian and Chinese strains of rice are two distinct variations, known as Japonica and Indica. However, they both belong to the same species, Oryza sativa, and both possess the exact same non-shattering gene, evolved identically. So scientists have come to generally agree that it would be impossible for them not to come from the same source. It had to start somewhere. Now, since scientists first started studying this topic, both countries have put a lot of money into commissioning research backing their own origin claims, which makes finding truth in the history books a complete mess. There are tons of studies from China which show irrefutable evidence of the Chinese origin, and just as many from India proving with certainty that they were the ones who made the breakthrough. Maybe the best actual clue comes from an American research team that in 2011 did a full genome mapping of more than 100 types of Indian and Chinese rice, and determined that the actual point of origin based on genetic comparisons with wild rice wasn't from the banks of the Yangtze or the Ganges. Instead, it was the floodplains of the Pearl River Delta in China's south close to Hong Kong. According to that theory, the rice from there would make its way across China and by land to India, along the way being crossbred with local endemic varietals. Anyway, one last point on the topic which may or may not be relevant, but in 2003, a team of archaeologists in Korea announced that they'd found evidence that rice actually originated there as far back as 15,000 BC, jumping the line even ahead of China and India. The studies flew in fast and furious from both of those countries, with literally thousands of papers discrediting the Korean claim. Successfully, by the way, as by now it's almost completely forgotten. At least China and India can work together sometimes. Anyway, regardless of where rice started, as soon as farmers figured out how to grow it, well, towns started forming, then cities. Here was something so abundant, so resilient, that it literally took Asian society from hunter-gatherers to urban dwellers, which finally brings us to our first meal. The earliest versions of rice eaten, whether in China, India, or Korea, wouldn't look that different to how you might typically see it today. some steamed rice along with a protein or maybe some simple vegetables. But around 1000 BC, we start to see the first culinary breakthroughs, the use of rice as a component in a complete dish. What we find at the very beginning is something incredibly simple, made with just rice and water, created after a flood to stretch a limited supply further. But as far as we know, it's the world's first rice recipe, a dish from China known as zhou.
So, all right, Michelin-rated zhou restaurant, although realistically, zhou is zhou. It's rice cooked until it's a soup. The texture, if you've never had it before, is kind of like oatmeal. You can make it as thick or as thin as you see fit, although this is pretty standard. It's kind of, right in the middle. The whole idea is just to stretch rice further, and in this case, put a couple of classic components in it. The more elegant, famous zhou restaurants will serve it with seafood, especially in South China. Here I just have sun-dried pork and century egg, which are both preserved ingredients that would have been in a classic zhou, at least as far as we know, a really long time ago. And we got it on the side with youtiao, thank you very much, otherwise known as patongo here in Thailand, which secretly is kind of what this is really all about.
The genius, of course, of zhou is that it stretches a limited supply of rice further, a way to save a population dependent on rice from starvation when there's not enough to go around. Zhou, also known as kanji, or here in Thailand, jok, is said to have been created in China during the Zhou dynasty. The name is probably just a coincidence, around 1000 BC. Now, the Zhou ruled from what's now Xi'an, and they pretty much based much of their rule on rice. They claimed to be descended from a man named Hou Ji, a figure from Chinese mythology who was, and this is hilarious if you've ever dealt with Chinese bureaucracy, an administrator, a prehistoric minister of agriculture who was revered for giving the Middle Kingdom rice. And through the spread of Zhou, the Zhou dynasty could claim to oversee an empire that was almost immune to famine. It wouldn't take long for zhou to spread wherever there was rice and to become revered as almost a miracle. You can find it in ancient recipes in Southeast Asia, Japan, and Korea, and also, of course, in the Indian subcontinent, where it was used not just as food, but as traditional medicine, and where we get the name kanji, a Tamil word meaning boiling. And to this day, in the same region where it first emerged, it's an everyday breakfast staple.
Never really thought about this, but since we're on camera and I have to look okay, eating zhou with a mustache is really causing me some trouble.
All right. Between the advent of non-shattering rice, the fast expansion of rice across Asia, and the introduction of dishes like zhou to make rice drought-proof, the 1,000 years before the year zero would see an explosion in both rice consumption and also more and more new recipes, new uses of rice adapted to local palates. In those years, we see the first example of sushi made in Japan, something called nare-sushi, fish and rice pickled together in salt, said to have originated around the year 300 BC. It's the time frame in India when we see the birth of something called Kheer, basically zhou but cooked in milk and sugar instead of water, seasoned with cardamom and topped with nuts, and almost definitely the world's first sweet rice dish. And it's around the same time as the Qin dynasty, the first to unify China, saw northerners from non-rice growing regions move south, where they began to make their own staple, noodles from rice instead of wheat. But those noodles, while they would spread around much of the world, well, they weren't technically the first rice noodles. Because long before those show up, another group of people from China had settled the basin of the Irrawaddy River in what today is Myanmar, bringing rice farming to Southeast Asia and putting their stamp on cuisine through their own signature dish. These were a people known as the Mon, and what they made brings us to the next part of this story. Now, we've talked at length about the Mon on this channel as they were massively influential in the origins of Southeast Asia. But basically, they were rice farmers who swept down from the Yangtze River Valley around 3500 BC. It's true that pretty much every civilization from this region would develop their own techniques and varietals of rice, but the first to sow the land, to plant the seeds, literally and figuratively, were the ethnic Mon. It's the Mon who introduced the region to irrigation and rice cultivation, and while they didn't leave a lot of records behind, we can follow their spread through two paths: their language and their most famous dish, something that would become a staple of ancient civilizations from the Lan Na to the Kheer. It was made by milling rice into flour and then making it into a dough, fermented in the tropical heat for preservation and then forced through small holes directly into boiling water. It's a technique still followed today, an essential part of the cuisine in Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, and even as far away as Sri Lanka and southern India. The Mon called it Hanom Cin, the root of the Thai name Hanom Cin. Like Joe, it was most likely developed to stretch a rice harvest even farther, something critical here in the floodlands and with the added benefit of tasting really, really good. Its history predates almost anything else still found in Southeast Asia, food or otherwise, and where it started, today's Myanmar, it's still the national dish. Served in a soup made of fish stock and aromatics, something found in every corner of the country. There it's known as a dish called Mohinga.
Oh, this is like the ultimate Burmese breakfast food. It's salty, it's a fish stock. You have the chickpea fritters because it's from Myanmar, which means there's going to be some kind of textural contrast. Egg, fish cake, and long beans, some cilantro or coriander if you prefer, and the soup with some chili on top. And yeah, this is just one of my all-time favorite things. It's a lot of people's favorite thing. This is a very popular dish. We did a whole video about these noodles, these rice noodles that you can see them all across Southeast Asia. Thailand is Hanom Cin, Cambodia it's Num Ban Chok, Vietnam it's Bun. And the whole point is that wherever you see this, that's where the ethnic Mon once settled. These are probably, and we don't know for sure, and there's some disagreement in South China, but probably the first rice noodles that were ever made. And it has a history that's a lot older than any kind of modern Southeast Asian society. And it helps that it's absolutely delicious. It's also pretty light, which I'm thankful for with the amount of eating that we have ahead of us. I'm already getting full.
By the year 500 BC, rice was found pretty much everywhere in the eastern half of Asia, and I mean everywhere, from the southernmost islands all the way into the Himalayas. And maybe the most fun part about tracing its spread isn't really the fundamentals of how it was traded, so much as the myths that spring up around its arrival. I mean, in the eyes of the earliest people, something this important had to be a gift from the gods. In fact, almost every culture and ethnic group in this part of the world has an origin story about this plant. And if you'll indulge me just a minute before we get back to the history, well, these are very much worth acknowledging. In China, the most common story involves the goddess Guan Yin, who you might also remember from our history of oysters. It's said that she gave her milk and her blood to create the first rice plant, with the milk explaining the white color of the grains, and the blood the reddish husk around the outside. To early Japan, it was another goddess, Amaterasu Omikami, who was given grains of rice by a swan flying through heaven and presented them as a gift to the Japanese islands. Female deities also play roles in a few ancient stories here in Thailand, where according to one legend, a goddess was cursed by the wives of farmers because she was too beautiful, and their husbands desired her affection. So she hid herself in shame and lived with her best friend, a freshwater fish, where she would remain until the farmers apologized, and as a show of goodwill, she gave them rice. Maybe my favorite story about the origin of rice comes from Tibet, where people once battled starvation as they relied on hunting in a land with few animals. One day, a dog came running across an empty field, and hanging from its tail were clusters of rice seeds, which they planted, and hunger disappeared. Versions of this story are found throughout the Himalayas and western China. One from the Miao people, where a dog with 9 tails went into heaven to steal a rice plant, fighting the heavenly gods, and in the process, seeing 8 of its tails cut off before achieving its mission and returning to Earth with rice, which is also the origin story of dogs. Regardless of which version is told in a community in the region from Sichuan to the Himalayas, it's still tradition to give the first cooked handful of that year's rice harvest to the family dog. A couple more than back to our story. In the Philippines, there's one legend that says a girl born into slavery named Agme was sitting at a river, crying tears of sadness when she saw a bundle of golden stalks floating with the current. She buried the plant in the mud next to the river, and when it grew, her family collected the rice and used it to buy their freedom. And a Laotian tale involves a farmer who had no food to eat, so he trapped a fish, but the fish turned out to be sacred. To prevent the fish from being eaten, the king of the fishes gave the farmer rice instead. Rice would become so important in Lao that eventually a king would take all the rice and hoard it in a locked dungeon. So a peasant went in search of the rice goddess, hacked her into pieces and planted them, which gave Lao countless varieties of the plant: white, black, long grain, short grain, and sticky rice. With so many types of rice now growing, the king could no longer control the supply, and from then on the people lived in abundance. And even though there are countless more, well, that's as good a segue as any into another important topic, which is the diversity of rice itself. With so many cultures and so many climates relying on the plant, it's not a surprise that this simple grain has evolved in thousands of different ways. Actually, 120,000 different ways. That's how many varieties of rice are said to exist today across the planet. 20,000 right here in Thailand alone, which all evolved from that very first Big Bang. It's a number that might sound crazy. I mean, it is crazy. But to see for ourselves, well, we had to take a trip to the local market.
I wonder if the ducks and chickens still remember me. Probably not. I don't think they're the same ones.
This is Klong Toi, Thailand's largest wet market and a place we just filmed a couple weeks ago, spending 24 hours here without leaving. And while then our focus was on the meats and vegetables, this is also where Bangkok shops for rice. There's rice in all forms, toasted for use in Isan cuisine, made into Hanom Cin or Mohinga noodles, and of course, sold straight from the farm in massive quantities.
All right, we already found our destination. We don't need to go beyond this. 31 types of rice at least. And obviously, we have all kinds of different sizes and variations of, Chinese white rice. We have all the Thai jasmine rice, the long grain Thai jasmine rice, I think is gonna be this. We have what looks like sticky rice. So this is gonna be the Isan sticky rice. 1, 2, 3 at a minimum of that. We have the unhusked varieties: black rice, brown rice, slightly less brown rice.
The diversity of rice on display at a place like Klong Toi is both impressive and, honestly, unless you grew up in this culture, confusing. Now, we need to get back to the history, but before this channel I was a chef, and the food side of this needs to be addressed. What's the difference between all these variations, and how does the choice of rice impact the dishes it's meant to be served with? Well, I can't answer that question, but I do know someone who can. So for our next meal, I set up an appointment with the owner of one of Thailand's best restaurants. This is Bandeng by Methavalai Sorndang, an offshoot of the Michelin-starred place that's often called one of the best Thai restaurants on the planet. The third-generation owner, my friend Nam, agreed to join us to pass along some of his secrets when it comes to selecting a proper rice to pair with his cuisine.
Tell me, as a Thai person, how important rice is in the culture, in the language of saying, like, how are you doing, essentially, right? Just explain to me about the importance of rice to somebody in Thailand.
Wow. Wow. What metaphor can I use? It's basically the same as just waking up and breathing. I'd say we eat it every single day. I'd say for the typical Thai, like, every day, just every day. It's an everyday thing for us. So it's very important.
According to Nam, of all the varietals you'll find at a market, there are subtle differences in tastes and textures, and certain sizes work better with some dishes. But for an educated shopper, what you're really paying attention to is not just the type of rice, but how it's treated after it's been harvested.
Wow. You were telling me off the air something that's really interesting about a side of choosing what rice you're going to use that I hadn't really considered.
Right. So I guess the most common is jasmine rice, which we use here as well. But what I've learned throughout my career is that the amount of time for rice storage before it is used has also effect of its uses as well. Typically, when a rice is stored give or take less than 3 months, it still has its starch content, which makes it more sticky, and most people use it for, let's say, jok, porridge. It creates a more sticky feeling, and then the aroma is going to be nicer. However, after it's stored later than 3 months, 6 months, or a year with proper storing, it can be more used in a versatile manner. For example, fried rice, it becomes less starchy, less sticky, and less clumpy. That's why it's a bit of a hidden technique. Like, you don't have to use a day-old rice. You can use rice that is properly stored for a long time. And so
You just cook it and fry it.
Yeah, just cook it and fry it, basically. Yeah.
What do you choose to use here?
So here we use typically 3 to 6 month old rice. So it's more versatile use in a restaurant manner. And for newer rice, it's much harder to cook properly because sometimes it's so easy to overcook it and it becomes this sort of like pasty kind of feel. So you get your rice. Yeah. Get your rice.
Thank you.
And then
let's do it here so we can Boris, if you want to film this from above while we're doing this.
All right. So basically, what you typically do, you get the sauce, the curry, and then you pour it over the rice. And then basically, you just do that, so the rice absorbs all the flavor, and that's how basically we eat khao lat gang.
All right, let me eat.
Thank you.
I gotta eat.
Go
this.
ahead.
I'm just sitting here
Enjoy.
looking at this. I got my plate off to the side.
Enjoy.
Yeah, thank you so much. Nice to see you again.
You're welcome.
Alright, to get back to the history, we left off around the time the Japanese developed sushi and the Mon created rice noodles, all using crops and techniques brought from China. But not long after that, the global rice trade would change, with China putting a hard stop on rice export. See, China might have become a nation completely dependent on rice, but by the time of the Qin dynasty, it was already clear that there just wasn't enough to go around. They had a growing population to feed and only a small percentage of land suitable for farming. So for a long time, there would be no more trade in Chinese rice. And so this story shifts to India, which was at its peak as the linchpin of global culinary commerce. Let's start around 500 BC when India was a trading partner of the ancient Persian Empire. At some point around that time, the Persians began to import quantities of Indian rice, the first time that it reached that far to Asia's west. Rice would become common in Persia, with their own agriculture centered around Basra in today's Iraq. The Persian Empire wouldn't last much longer. It would fall to the Greeks under Alexander the Great in the year 330 BC, and it was that conquest that first introduced rice to Europe and the Western world. As a matter of fact, it's also how we get the word rice, from the Greek oryza, which was taken from the language of Persia, which itself came a very long time ago from India's southern language of Tamil. Anyway, just because the Persians were growing rice doesn't mean they were using it as a staple food source. After all, theirs was a baking culture and rice should be steamed, something not yet found in West Asia. Instead, as far as we can tell, in Persia and later in ancient Greece, rice was used for making into flour for desserts and most of all, for making beer. After rice first shows up in Persia, it would be another few centuries before it would become part of their diet. And for that, well, let's go back to China again. Well, maybe not China itself, I mean, it was close to the rice trade, but to the borderlands where Chinese rice had first spread so long ago. One of those neighboring countries to China's west was Uzbekistan, where as far back as the 4th century AD, the people were known to favor a local dish of rice cooked in stock with spices, called hualao in Chinese, locally pronounced as pilaf. After the Muslim conquest of Central Asia in the 700s, new trade routes would spring up linking the region to the Middle East. It was along those paths that pilaf was first introduced from Uzbekistan to Persia, and then during the Mughal Empire from Persia to India, where it would become biryani. That dish would change the way rice was consumed in the Middle East. And for our next meal, well, that's where we're headed. In the alleys between Bangkok's Sukhumvit Soi 3 and Soi 5, there's a neighborhood known as the Arab Quarter, the home to a densely packed maze of restaurants run by and servicing people from the Muslim world. And one thing those cultures have in common, from Morocco to Iraq, is the use of rice. But nothing draws a crowd like this one of my favorite dishes served in this city, a legendary Bedouin dish known as mansaf rice.
All right, so I understand that at this stage in the shoot, and this is not a camera trick, we've done this all in succession, having this enormous 10-kilo plate of food is a strong choice. However, I don't care what the circumstances are, I will always have room for this. This is mansaf rice, and it is the national dish of Jordan. It's found sort of throughout the Levant region. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, it's very popular. And what it is it's basically rice that's cooked in a sauce made of yogurt. We have more of the yogurt sauce here. Mutton is the meat of choice, and it's cooked on top of and with bread, which is the flat bread of the Middle East. So I'm gonna start scooping this, and it is just like, this is a treat. This is the kind of thing, we've never filmed at this restaurant before. This is called Hafid, and the restaurant itself is actually Egyptian, but they do have foods from throughout the region, and this is the highlight. Me and Daria actually came here for this off camera like a week ago, and that's something that we do quite frequently whenever we're in the mood. I would say that this is one of our 2 or 3 most frequent stops in the whole city for a place that we eat regularly off camera. So yeah, mansaf rice. It's a dish that has a ton of history. Like thousands of years of history as a Bedouin dish. The incorporation of rice is more modern. It was traditionally mutton, yogurt sauce, and bread. However, rice as a staple grain in the Middle East is also something that has ancient history, because of course it does, it's rice. That's unbelievable. I'm gonna just eat because the hair salon across the street is celebrating Songkran, which is Thai New Year. And so they were very nice and agreed to turn their like blasting music off for us while we were filming. But I told them just a few minutes, and then we promise we'll let you get back to your party. So I'm gonna let them do that because I have work to do. There's a lot to eat, and talking is just distracting me from the actual mission. Unreal.
All right. As long and convoluted as the path of rice is, the one thing that's certain, the one universal truth, is that in ancient history, rice grew wild across much of the world before somewhere, probably China, maybe India, after thousands of years of trying, breeders were able to crack the genetic code and successfully domesticate rice. I mean, we covered that right at the beginning, and it's the most important thing that might have ever happened in food. But it's not the whole story. What isn't usually included in the history books is that there was a second domestication, half a world away from Asia. A second miracle of agriculture completely independent from the one that we all know about. It happened around 3,500 years ago in Africa, and you probably don't know about it because nobody talks about Africa, but it happened in what's now the country of Nigeria. And for the people there, it would be history-changing. Now, according to theory, and keep in mind this isn't well documented, as the Sahara dried out around 2500 BC, the local versions of wild rice, which were once abundant across the whole of Africa, became in the northern hemisphere harder to find. So the people set out to make their own. For the record, this would happen more than 1,000 years before any record of trade between Africa and either China or India. In fact, a full 1,500 years before the first rice was shipped to the port at Alexandria. This was something completely different and totally independent. Unique in global history, and the only rice found anywhere on Earth that belongs to a different species than Oryza sativa. Basically, we start here in Nigeria, and the area we're talking about is here, the delta of the Niger River. Now, again, this story has to rely on a bit of speculation, but the farmers who first managed this incredible accomplishment were most likely from a group of 16 small clans known as the Volta Niger, who were pastoral farmers and yet were still, according to archaeology, advanced enough that they were smelting metal as early as almost anyone else on Earth. And it would take an advanced civilization to have developed this rice because it was no joke of an achievement. It was bred in a way that still baffles scientists, with a dense canopy that prevents the growth of weeds, a faster maturation than that of Asian rice, and most significantly, the ability to thrive in even the harshest of conditions, tolerating bad soil, arid soil, and even no soil at all, growing literally on top of the water in the Delta region. When this rice, by the way, was first encountered by European slave traders, they wrote of its impressive nature and described its cultivation as the most complex they'd ever seen. Anyway, just like in Asia, after rice was domesticated, it led to the construction of cities, with the first recorded a place called Ile-Ife. It was here that the Volta Niger would consolidate into a tribe known as the Yoruba, who today number almost 45 million. In the Yoruba language, by the way, the name Ile-Ife translates to the home of expansion. From that new city, the domesticated rice would quickly spread across a large swath of West Africa, blanketing the coastline and moving inland as far as Lake Chad. It would be this rice that would serve as the staple food for the greatest empires that region has ever seen, beginning with the Mali Kingdom, which would spread from the Niger Basin to become, for a time, the richest civilization on Earth. The consumption of rice would also be the linchpin of the Songhai, the great rivals and eventual successors of the Mali. For a time, there were a number of large kingdoms centered in West Africa, all consuming local rice, which again means this story's about to get controversial. See, somewhere in one of those civilizations, sometime in the 1500s, a dish emerged that would quickly become the single most iconic food of West Africa. It was made by cooking rice with onions and tomatoes, which had just arrived from the Portuguese. Now, this dish, which would be called jollof rice, would lead to centuries of intense feuds between West African countries, particularly Ghana, Nigeria, Mali, and Senegal, as to where it first actually originated. And when I say intense, I mean this manifested not just in generations of arguments, but in more recent years. Cook-offs, articles, and even musical battles with rival songs staking their claims to the dish. In the end, UNESCO got involved and decided the actual credit should go to Senegal, which in all honesty should have been obvious from the beginning because the name of the dish itself comes from the Senegalese Jollof people. But I guess it didn't really matter because in West Africa there are so many other preparations using rice, including even in versions of the continent's most beloved staple.
You will allow your water to boil. When the water is already boiled, then you mix it. When you mix it, you will use something like this to turn it until it is done. It's very easy to do. Perfect.
In a back alley across from the Arab Quarter, above a hair salon behind an unmarked entrance, there's Bangkok's best West African restaurant. It's run by a man named Andy, who invited us to visit to show us his famous jollof rice, and also how he makes fufu, the Nigerian staple, not with the more common cassava, but instead using rice.
For that one bag of flour, how much water is in this? Or you just know? You don't measure, you just know.
I don't measure. I don't measure. But I know exactly how
much water to add.
Yeah. Even if the water is too much, you still add the rice flour. When you are turning it, because you have to put it on fire so that it will be done. When you see that it's already thick, because you have to make sure that it's a little bit thick, then you will keep the reserve water standby. So this is the oil.
Yeah.
You add it small, put it small, so that when customer is eating, because we normally eat with hand, so when you are eating,
It doesn't stick to you.
yeah, it will be just smooth and easy because of the oil. Like before, if I have a big customer, I can make more. That is when I need somebody to hold the pot for me.
Well, I worked in kitchens for long enough. My hands don't get hot. I don't have any feeling in my hands anymore, so no problem.
You see, it's already smooth. So it's already done.
Agusi, second time we've shown it on the channel, but this version is just something else. And this is why we are here. Every culture and country that has a history of farming rice, and in Nigeria it goes back 3,000, 4,000 years. It's such a versatile thing, not necessarily in the climates where it grows, but in the uses of it. And to be able to substitute the classic cassava for rice flour is just, and to keep that textural integrity, it's awesome. So, You make yours a little bit spicy. I like that. That's if we thought we were starting to get full, that hit of chili pepper is going to wake us right back up again. It's fantastic. Let's try the rice. All right, so here, the texture of the rice is going to be a little bit different from what we saw, for example, at Bandeng, when we were kind of looking at the Thai way of making rice. And you go to, how rice is served in China, where it's going to be a little bit lighter and fluffier. And in this case, because of the tomato that it's stewed in, this has almost a sticky texture. It's something that almost feels like it's like, how would you describe this? It's like it's more like a risotto than a bowl of Chinese rice. Yeah, it's fantastic, and the cool thing is, again, such a completely different flavor profile than anywhere else we've been today. It just shows the versatility of rice and the reasons why it's appreciated by people everywhere.
The ancient Nigerian rice is today almost extinct, increasingly replaced since the 1970s by the Chinese varietal for the primary reason that it's more cost-effective, since through genetic engineering it now yields a bigger harvest. But there's a massive legacy of the African culture of rice, not least of which can be found throughout the Caribbean, where the first strains planted in the 1560s were brought from Nigeria. As a matter of fact, more than half of all African slaves were taken from the rice-growing region, mainly because European slavers found that it was easy to stock up on food supplies for the transatlantic journey, thanks to the abundance of local rice. There are even stories in places like Jamaica that said that slaves held in bondage used to hide grains of rice in their clothes and even in their hair, so that if they ever became free, they could plant their own crop and build a new life. And to this day, rice is found in pretty much every meal from Jamaica to Trinidad and the Dominican Republic, and of course on the continent as well, in both North and South America. The story of rice in the New World isn't simple or straightforward. There are many different points of origin, from European trade to the arrival of Indian plantation workers. There's even a theory, thus far not proven but also worth observing, that it's possible there could have even been a third domestication event in Brazil around 5,000 years ago, using their own strains of wild rice that grew in the Amazon basin. What we know for sure is that today, rice is a key component in the cuisine of Mexico, where it arrived with the Spanish, which is why it's sometimes called Spanish rice. In Peru, where it also came with the Spanish and where a common dish, arroz chaufa, was introduced by the Chinese in the 1800s and takes its name from chow fan, fried rice in Mandarin. And it's consumed in Brazil. Maybe not their own native strains, but there you can find white rice brought by the Portuguese, and also something called red rice, which is the species from West Africa. Maybe almost gone from its original home, but thriving in Brazilian cuisine. And of course, there's also the United States. And one more time, this gets complicated. The most common version of the story is that rice was first cultivated in 1685 in South Carolina using rice seed brought from Madagascar. Now that rice was the same that we first find way back at the beginning of this story in China, which worked its way to Taiwan, was brought to the Philippines by Austronesians around 5,000 years ago, and then they would introduce it to the islands across the Pacific, Madagascar included. And it is true that the so-called Carolina rice would become a key crop in the colonial economy, helping drive the domestic commerce that would finance the American Revolution. But there's more to it than that, and somehow, our last story might be the craziest one of this entire video. This time, for the first time ever on OTR, we start in my hometown, Charlottesville, Virginia, in the year 1787 at a place called Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson, who 11 years earlier had written the American Declaration of Independence. Having played a role in uniting the colonies into one brand new country, Mr. Jefferson had a conundrum, which is why America's main trading partner, France, refused to buy Carolina rice. Maybe he thought it was because the American rice wouldn't grow in a more mountainous climate, so Jefferson traveled to Italy, into the Alps to a region that was growing its own rice, and despite an Italian law promising the death penalty to rice smugglers, he made his way back to the coast with rice seed in his pockets. Planting this rice at Monticello, he was disappointed to find out it was exactly the same plant as the varietal from South Carolina, so that wasn't it. As fate would have it, he'd receive a copy of a travelogue written by a missionary to Vietnam, who described finding rice of the most perfect color and quality. So Jefferson decided that would be his next mission, to obtain a sample of Vietnamese rice. Again, this led him back to Europe in hopes of enlisting the help of his friend, the head of the French Navy, who often sailed to Vietnam. But what Jefferson found was even more exciting. See, in Paris at the time was the son of the exiled Vietnamese King Nguyen An, along with his guardian, Bishop Pierre Pignot, forced into hiding because of the Tay Son Rebellion, literally the subject of our video 2 weeks ago. Anyway, Jefferson received an audience with the prince, who promised to send him a French ship full of rice on his return to his homeland. But that would never happen, as shortly after Jefferson returned to Virginia, the French pulled back their support of the Nguyen family, and anyway, by the time Nguyen An would win his war on his own, his son had died of smallpox at the age of 21. But Jefferson was now obsessed, and he would eventually receive his Asian rice, not from Vietnam but from Sumatra, delivered by none other than Lieutenant William Bligh, deposed in the mutiny of the HMS Bounty and left stranded on the island of Timor. Since Bligh could no longer hope to show any success from his mission, which had been to deliver breadfruit trees to England, he instead wanted to salvage something, so he scavenged a small amount of local Indonesian rice. After his return to England, he'd present that rice to the botanist Joseph Banks, who would eventually deliver it all to Jefferson, with a note informing him that he'd just received the entirety of the ill-fated mission of the HMS Bounty. However, sadly, this rice proved unsuccessful growing at Monticello and also at the home of Jefferson's friend James Madison, the writer of the US Constitution. But still, all was not lost. In the end, the success of Jefferson's quixotic quest for rice started with a chance meeting in 1789 with a young Bostonian captain who'd heard about these struggles and offered to help, this time by sailing for the west coast of Africa, where he said he'd heard of a rice that surpassed all others in both quality and adaptability. The sailor returned a few months later with a 10-gallon drum of rice purchased from a local farmer in what's now Guinea, the western edge of Africa's ancient rice-growing region, where he divided it into portions and sent them to growers he'd involved in his quest, including, of course, none other than George Washington, who had just begun his first term as the President of the United States. Now, long story slightly shorter, the African rice didn't succeed in Virginia, but it did in the hills of Georgia, so successfully that it would soon spread across the entire southern region of the country. And in 1803, after Jefferson himself negotiated the Louisiana Purchase, that land, including the delta of the Mississippi River, would be populated with the very same African slaves who, once they saw this unique red rice, well, they knew exactly what to do with it. And thus a new cuisine would develop, a fusion of influences from the French and Spanish who had previously colonized Louisiana, the new American settlers, and most of all, the cooks from West Africa.
All right, so this is not going to be a struggle for the last meal of the day, as full as we are, because this is the taste of home. I'm so excited for this. And it smells great. Like, we got the jambalaya with andouille sausage and pulled chicken, and we have the gumbo, which is with seafood, shrimp and crab meat, both rice-based dishes from New Orleans. And yeah, so usually on the channel when we film at a restaurant that has music playing like this, we have to ask them to please turn it off for us while we film, just because of copyright laws. It really hurt to make that request here, because this is, again, like Dr. John playing in a New Orleans-themed restaurant. Steve Miller Band was the last song that was just on, and I have to ask them to please turn it off. But let's give the food a try and then stop talking, and also stop eating because it's a lot of rice today. New Orleans food is amazing. Quite surprised to find a decent version of jambalaya so far away from home. It's a little bit sweeter than I would want it, but you know, that's, I guess, what the local palate wants. It's delicious, honestly, and the sausage is great. As my initial excitement wears off, and I start to realize how much we've actually eaten so far today and how much rice we've eaten so far today, I think it's about time to wrap this up, both literally and figuratively. I'm going to take this away and bring it home for Daria.
All right, for our last bit of rice history, we return to where we started with that very first origin story, in Vietnam, except this time not in ancient history, but in the 20th century. It's the last years of the colony of French Indochina, and in spite of what we all know now was about to happen, there was no sign yet that the country was primed for a communist revolution. Hell, even Ho Chi Minh was living overseas, where he'd been for almost 30 years. Back home, the biggest concern wasn't one of politics, it was the much more urgent matter of starvation. See, the French had realized there was a big market for exported rice, so they were sending the local stock overseas. And at their factories, they even burned the Vietnamese rice for fuel. When World War II broke out, things became dire. The Japanese sent an army to take control of Vietnam, and to keep them at bay, the French signed a treaty, promising Japan 1 million tons of Vietnamese rice per year. And then after the two countries entered a sort of shared occupation, it got even worse, with the Japanese seizing even more food while at the same time forcing subsistence farmers to switch to military production. Between 1944 and 1945, a catastrophic famine gripped Vietnam, particularly in the north. And with Ho Chi Minh now back and trying to rally an army, he found a winning cause in promising not political change, but rice. Backed by legions of rice farmers, his revolution would pick up support, gain steam, and eventually that would lead to everything that came after. In other words, if the French had simply understood the life or death importance of rice, the entire course of modern history might have unfolded differently, and it's possible, maybe even likely, that the Vietnam War would never have happened. The truth is, there are more stories like this from all throughout history. It was a rice shortage that led to the fall of the Khmer. Rice riots brought down a Japanese government in 1918, and India and Pakistan are embroiled in a bitter feud over basmati, and that's just the tip of the riceberg. If I have one takeaway from making this video, it's that there's no way to properly do it justice. That's the thing about a subject like rice, which is so closely linked to everything from history, commerce, and mythology in countries across the planet. The closer you look, the more layers you find, from ancient China to India to, well, pretty much everywhere. Today, rice is the most widely eaten food on Earth. It's grown in 117 of the world's 195 countries, and its consumption continues to increase every single year. It's thrown at newly married couples at weddings, celebrated with festivals across Asia and Africa, and used in religious rituals in the Indian subcontinent. It provides billions of people with sustenance and a source of income, and is both affordable enough to feed a family and diverse enough to please the best chefs from across the planet. Rice tells the story of cultures, empires, and trade, and it's a story that we're still uncovering, with new research continuing to broaden our understanding of just how important this simple grain has been since the very beginning of time. This might not be a complete narrative. There's so much more we could still cover. More rebellions and origin legends and so many more dishes out there for us to try. But for now, at the very least, we can say that this has been our very best attempt at covering the most important story in the history of food, the story of rice. Subscribe to the channel for more from OTR. Thank you so much to everyone who supports us on Patreon. It really helps to keep us going. Find links below to our Patreon and social media, and we'll see you next week. I mean, the concept of food wars is not new. Like, there's stuff like kimchi, hummus, French fries, or French fries. I mean, the concept of food wars is not new. Like, there's stuff like kimchi, hummus, French. All right. I mean, the concept of food wars is not new. Like, let me just take French fries out.
Ron Burgundy.
Yeah. I mean, the concept of food wars isn't new. Like, there's God.